Good evening. I'm actually honored to be with all of you Texas patriots here this evening to talk about an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I'm really here for one overarching reason, and that is that you need to know what I know relative to the current existential threat that we face at our southern border. For decades, the two top threats to this nation have been terrorism and illegal drugs. They are still the two top threats to the nation. It is not, as our current White House and FBI director are trying to sell to the American public, domestic violent extremism, which is a euphemism, a very weak one for MAGA extremism or what have you. It's dope and terror. Only now we face an even more deadly combination of the two in the form of narco-terrorism, specifically the Mexican variety. So, and by the way, made all the more acute by elements of our own government that allow open borders and excuse criminal behavior. So allow me to start with what I call the bluff, the bottom line up front, and that is this, that we're not just fighting Mexican drug cartels, we're fighting the world's most powerful and prolific narco-terrorists who happen to be based in Mexico. Narco-terrorists that not only control the entire U.S.-Mexico border, but have their greatest foreign presence outside of their country right here in ours. Now we're going to start off by taking a look at this issue, and mainly we're here, that's my background, not illegal immigration. I think most people have a pretty good idea what's going on there without an explanation. But we're going to look at this issue from a global perspective and slowly bring it closer to home. Along the way, we're going to talk a little drug policy, some drug history, even some popular culture and some politics. And by the time we get done tonight, the choices before us will be absolutely clear. Now, I have to warn you, I do have just a handful of slides here this evening that are rather graphic in nature, so I'll just give you a warning in advance. We'll try to move through them fairly quickly, but they're there only for one reason, and that is that you need to know exactly what's going on with the Mexican cartels. Former U.S. Attorney Andrew McCarthy once said that civilization does not come about, nor does it survive by accident. It must be defended. It must be upheld by those committed to civility, decency, and adherence to the law. Our society is not some naturally occurring evolution, but is actually the imposition of human good over human evil. And as we know, the good requires constant reinforcement, whereas the bad just needs permission. And as we go about fighting our various enemies and adversaries, both foreign and domestic, there will be no easy political fix, no magic bullet. What we do is hard, and it's hard all the time. Now, this quote comes from the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, with whom I served over there in the early days immediately after 9/11. And to be fair, he was just talking about trying to stem the flow of narco dollars to the bad guys in that place at that time. But this applies to us all right here, right now. This is not a war on drugs we're engaged in, not literally. It's a struggle. It's a hard, perpetual struggle against complex social, criminal, and pharmacological forces, pushing constantly and insidiously against the safety and well-being of our citizens. And as drug trafficking and international terrorism increasingly intersect and converge, this problem is no longer one that simply involves public health and public safety, but our very national security. Now, everybody knows about the ABCs of the WMD, but for the most part, these are potential threats to Americans on any given day. It's actually the next letter in our alphabet soup that's currently killing 110,000 Americans every single year and continuing to rise. That, by the way, is on average more than 300 a day. Let me ask you, what do you think our mainstream media would report on every night on the evening news if 300 dolphins were to wash up dead on our beaches every single day? Of course, you know the answer to that. But in addition to these drug overdose deaths, more accurately described, by the way, as drug poisonings, 4 million Americans enter substance abuse treatment programs every year. 2 million visit hospital emergency rooms suffering from drug overdose symptoms. And 1/4 of those, by the way, are from that supposedly safe, natural drug, marijuana. Lastly, illegal drugs cost our society now $3 trillion every year in lost productivity, social, criminal, and health-related costs of every kind. If I were going to introduce a substance to hollow out a society, to destroy it from within, I could think of nothing better than drugs to do it with. Now, if you take a look at the methods and the tactics of both drug trafficking organizations and foreign terrorists, they're remarkably similar. The only difference really is just a matter of degree. You see, terrorists look to overthrow the entire existing political order, replace it with a system of communism, socialism, perhaps an Islamic caliphate. Drug traffickers, not so much. They only look to degrade and erode those government forces that oppose them so they can continue to operate within the weakened husk of the state to make money off the backs of addiction. They're both single-minded, zealous, highly ethnocentric, and shockingly violent. They both operate in highly compartmentalized, cellularized structures. They both depend on what we call shadow facilitators, those ancillary support players that provide weapons or precursor chemicals or money laundering services. And one last thing, whether we like it or not, both the terrorists and the traffickers take our forgiving multiculturalism and our moral and cultural relativism as weakness. Now, of all the foreign terrorist groups throughout the world so designated by the U.S. government, more than 1/3 have been definitively linked to the drug trade. Every political stripe, religious orientation one can imagine, located on just about every continent across the globe, with one glaring exception up here, ours, specifically that country just to our south, and we're going to talk about that. But first, let's take a look at drug production zones globally, and we're talking about the organics here, mainly cocaine and heroin, not synthetics, which can be produced anywhere, as well as those drug flows to international markets. As those drug flows pass through territory controlled by, or at least occupied by, foreign terrorist groups, they would be remiss if they didn't try to capitalize on the vast profits that can be made from drug trafficking. And increasingly they do. There is no more lucrative illicit product on the global economic stage better than drugs. Not arms, not the illegal theft of crude oil, not even the trafficking of human beings. $500 billion is the estimated value of the global drug trade according to the UN. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the equivalent of the entire global gas and oil market for ExxonMobil. So going after drug traffickers is not just key to protecting our citizens and enforcing the rule of law, it also becomes critical to denying revenue to terrorist groups throughout the world intent upon our destruction. Now, we're really here to talk mainly about drugs, but allow me to digress just for a moment and point out that the U.S. happens to be the largest consumer of human trafficking in the world. Not just in terms of actual human beings, but also some of those secondary products like child pornography. And we know it's the same organizations engaged in the vile business of sex slavery and child trafficking as those moving drugs into the U.S. So for anyone to argue that we can solve either of those two problems simply with more treatment and prevention without the full weight and imagination of the law is guilty, in my mind, of both moral and intellectual cowardice. Some of the quintessential narco-terrorist groups throughout the world, very briefly, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, been around since the 1960s, long supported themselves with the cocaine trade. For a while, they actually became one of Colombia's largest drug trafficking groups. But because they still have their revolutionary objective to overthrow the democratic government in Colombia and replace it with a system of communism, they've also become highly adept at trading cocaine for military-grade weapons throughout the world, further destabilizing the world. Lebanese Shiite terrorists from Hezbollah, dedicated to the destruction of Israel, as well as the United States of America. Long supported by their fellow Shia, their big brothers in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Over the years, sanctions against Iran have severely limited their financial support to Hezbollah terrorist activities. So these guys have increasingly turned to international drug trafficking, not just in the Middle East and Europe, but throughout the world, including forming partnerships with several of the Mexican drug cartels. It's been estimated that there are roughly 200,000 Lebanese immigrants currently residing in Mexico with ties to Hezbollah. At least that was the figure 2 years ago, before we let 8 million people into this country illegally. 2 million of them gotaways. And of course, our old friends in Afghanistan. There is absolutely no doubt today that Afghanistan is a narco state in every sense of the word. 90% of the heroin coming out of Afghanistan, or 90% of the heroin in the world today is produced in Afghanistan. There are only two sources of income to the current Taliban government in Kabul: international assistance and the drug trade, and not in that order. And after the greatest foreign policy debacle of our generation, I'm talking about our ignominious exit from Afghanistan in 2021, these guys now possess $80 billion worth of the world's finest American military and equipment and hardware. That was not just predicted to have international repercussions, but it already has, when some of that equipment has leaked to Hamas and used against Israel. All right, bringing it closer to home, Americans spend $150 billion every single year buying illegal drugs. Ultimately, about half of that, $75 billion, finds its way into the coffers of the various Mexican drug cartels. That kind of money doesn't just destabilize Mexico, it allows these transnational criminal groups to be more powerful than the very federal government in Mexico itself, including along the entire Mexico-U.S. border. Now, if you remember the Colombian cartels of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you obviously remember how incredibly efficient they were at combining international drug trafficking with new levels of violence. But today, the Mexicans make them look like pikers. In addition to even more acute levels of violence that clearly transcend the threshold of what we define as terrorism, the Mexicans have become highly adept at what global economists describe as market diversification, both the vertical and the horizontal integration of markets. Vertically meaning they've come to dominate every level of the supply chain, from production, transportation, smuggling across borders, wholesale distribution, even retail level sales, not just here in the U.S., but in 100 countries throughout the world. But also horizontally, meaning they've branched out into new types of drugs not traditional to Mexico, beginning with methamphetamine in the 1990s, and now, as we know so well, fentanyl, xylazine. But beyond drugs themselves to new types of organized crime, beyond mere auto theft and extortion at the border to global levels of human trafficking, illegal mining, logging, fishing, the trafficking of exotic and endangered species to China. You know, there's a slang term used all across Mexico today called a huachicolero, which roughly translates to an oil pirate. Every 90 minutes, there's an illegal tap on a Pemex oil pipeline, sanctioned by one of the cartels, designed to steal and sell oil on the black market. It's about to bring that state-run oil company to its knees. Now, you don't necessarily have to be an expert on the territorial boundaries of the cartels in Mexico, mainly because they change almost daily, but you might want to know who's in your own backyard. DEA puts this map out, updates it from time to time, showing cartel presence, ownership, really, of some of our big cities in the U.S. But for the most part, this map just depicts DEA's large division offices. It's actually Homeland Security that's estimated that the various Mexican cartels have a presence in over 3,000 American cities and towns in all 50 states. They are here solely to sell drugs to Americans and engage in other types of organized crime. I can think of nothing better as far as a modern example of Cicero's warning to his fellow Romans about allowing an enemy within the gates. Just like terrorists, the Mexican cartels practice terrorism and barbarity in order to accomplish two goals. The first, quite obviously, is to cow and crush any opposition, be it the government, the public, or rival traffickers. Secondly, and this may actually be the more important of the two, is that it tends to intensify and invigorate faith among their own members. We've had just a handful of sicarios, or Mexican hitmen, executioners, cooperate with U.S. law enforcement, talk about how absolutely exhilarating it is to kill on behalf of your cartel, your organization, to cut somebody's heart out, to skin somebody alive and then cut his hands off, placing them on his throat to announce to the world that he was a snitch. But I would remind you that terrorism is not a specific entity, nor is it even a particular ideology. It's a tactic, and it's a tactic being employed every day by every single one of the Mexican cartels to better move dope into the U.S. and to engage in organized crime on a global scale. You know, several years ago, the world was aghast that ISIS in northern Syria was using young boys to cut the heads off of infidels. But you know what? They've been doing it for a lot longer in Mexico. Only in this case, we welcome these little dreamers into our country, hoping one day they're going to be valedictorians or Harvard grads, when in fact the vast majority of them gravitate back to the only life they know, which is the gang life. Quite simply, gangs of every color and type across the U.S. are the proxies, the foot soldiers for their big brothers in the cartels, selling drugs at the retail level, the local level. And like their big brothers, they too are single-minded, zealous, highly ethnocentric, and violent. Drug money is the high-octane fuel that allows these gangs to grow and metastasize and become more predatory in the very communities that they inhabit. By the way, anybody know how many sworn law enforcement officers we have in the U.S. at every level, local, state, federal, and tribal? 800,000. That's all, in a country of 335 million people. So with all the other tasks that law enforcement has on a daily basis, they're already outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 just by the gangbangers alone. And you know what? We keep importing more by the day. All right, let's talk about the origins and the genesis of the most violent and terroristic of all the Mexican cartels, the Zetas, the organization that is responsible for the evolution and the adoption of terrorist tactics across all of the cartels, leading us to where we are today. Story begins in 1999 when the Mexican government created the Air Mobile Special Forces Group, the GAFIs. 350-man unit culled from the finest that the Mexican military had to offer at that time, given the finest weapons, training, equipment. Much of that training, by the way, compliments of Uncle Sam at Fort Benning, Georgia. These guys were exceptionally good at what they were designed to do, which was to take it to the heart of every single one of the cartels at that time. Highly trained in aerial assaults, ambushes, counter-surveillance, secure communications, redundant systems of every kind. But almost immediately, one unit within the GAFIs, the Z unit, and Zeta is simply the letter Z in Spanish, defected en masse to go to work as the private mercenary army of the Gulf Cartel. With them, they took their tactics, their training, and they began to incorporate new types of terroristic acts they picked up by watching videos posted on the World Wide Web at that time by Al-Qaeda and Taliban elements out of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, all 30 original Z unit members have been killed or captured, but not before they were able to rapidly expand their numbers by franchising gangs all across Mexico, training them in those same tactics and weapons and terroristic acts. Here's one of their training camps in northern Mexico. As you can see, not just small arms, but military-grade weapons, fragmentation grenades, law rockets. In this particular training camp right here, just 60 miles south of the U.S. border. You know, for many years, our government has lectured the Pakistanis. I know, I used to be part of those discussions, that they cannot, they must not allow themselves to be used as safe haven for terrorists fleeing Afghanistan, taking up refuge in their country. Well, let me ask you, when the Mexican government brings the heat, as they occasionally still do, where do you think their safe haven is? That's right, they saunter across our border at will, taking up refuge in our country. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been fundamentally unserious about protecting ourselves at our southern border, not just from drug smugglers and human traffickers, but from narco-terrorists. All right, after violently separating themselves from the Gulf Cartel to form their own transnational criminal group, the Zetas literally rolled onto the scene when 5 severed heads were thrown on a crowded discotheque dance floor in Acapulco, Mexico. It didn't just shock the world, it took rival traffickers completely by surprise that such levels of terroristic barbarity would be used in simple trafficker-on-trafficker disputes. But rival traffickers didn't just respond in kind, they had to up the ante in an escalating game of quid pro quo. Couldn't just cut off heads anymore. You had to dismember entire bodies and scatter the body parts in macabre public displays, along with what became known as a narcomanta, a narcotics messaging banner. This one announcing to the world the presence of another new cartel at that time, La Familia Michoacana. And of course, this level of ruthlessness didn't just stay contained among the bad guys, it would engulf the good guys. And no, I'm not talking about just corrupt Mexican cops. They get killed every day working for the wrong side. I'm talking about trained, vetted, hand-picked Mexican federal agents working with their U.S. counterparts from DEA and HSI, targeted precisely because they were uncorrupted, kidnapped, tortured, killed, and stacked like cordwood on the side of the road in violation of every civilizational standard I know. This is not mere crime. This is terrorism. And this calls for the tools and the resources of counterterrorism. All right, shifting gears a little bit. The term war on drugs has been so corrupted and defiled over the years that it no longer means what it was meant to mean. It's also produced an a number of self-anointed experts to come out of the woodwork telling us we've been doing it all wrong. Experts like Brad Pitt. He says he can land in any American city and still buy whatever you need within 24 hours. Yeah, I guess that makes him an expert. Or Richard Branson says America is a police and prison state now, imprisoning millions of our fellow citizens simply for using drugs. Well, even Time magazine has described Sir Richard Branson as a man filled with too much hubris, too much hucksterism, and too little knowledge. And former president of Mexico himself, Vicente Fox, says our war on drugs has been useless because his country, he says, has been victimized, merely being sandwiched between drug producer and drug consumer nations. Well, with all due respect to Senior Fox, not only is Mexico a drug-producing nation, it is the principal drug-producing nation in terms of methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, marijuana, as well as the transshipment of ton quantities of cocaine, not just to their northern neighbors, but increasingly the world. And by the way, most people don't realize as far as drug consumption goes, Mexico has a drug use and addiction problem that rivals much of the U.S., especially in terms of methamphetamine. What all of these experts are selling is not expertise whatsoever. They're selling their own self-promotion or particular agenda. The term war on drugs does in fact come from Richard Nixon in 1971, but it was not designed to be a literal call to war, but rather a metaphorical call to arms, the moral equivalent to war, in exactly the same way that his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, had done with his war on poverty, or Jimmy Carter had subsequently done with his war on cancer. By the way, have we won those two other wars yet? But it's little remembered today that Nixon's main weapon in his war on drugs was actually drug treatment. President Nixon increased drug treatment and prevention 8-fold within 2 years, consuming fully 2/3 of the drug control budget and dwarfing the monies allocated to the supply side or enforcement programs across government. But the president and the nation would come to learn the limitations of government's ability to affect behavior solely through compassionate or therapeutic means. You see, without the ability to compel drug addicts into long-term treatment, initial drug treatment failed 90 to 95% of the time. By the way, fast forward to today, initial drug treatment fails 90 to 95% of the time. That's why it's called a chronic relapsing condition. In fact, Boston University did a landmark study a while back that found that for the average drug addict, the mean number of drug treatment episodes is actually 6.9 times over a 6.5-year period before it finally takes hold. And by the way, that study didn't include the number of people who died along the way. So too with drug prevention. Although we so want to believe that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, we have found over the years that unless we simultaneously reduce drug availability in our communities, most of those drug prevention programs have been found to be, quote, largely ineffectual. What did make a difference in Nixon's day was targeting the Corsican Italian mafia supplying the vast majority of heroin to Americans at that time, known as the French Connection. It was law enforcement that staunched this nation's first opioid epidemic, and it would be law enforcement that would do it again and again against future threats, future transnational criminal groups. Folks, here's one of the main points I want to make tonight, and that is this, that although drug treatment and prevention are absolutely necessary, given their limited efficacy, for society writ large, strategically, law enforcement may actually be the most effective and compassionate long-term drug treatment and prevention program available to us today. And we should say so without apology. Our exploding homeless crisis in the country, still exploding by the way, is, as you probably already know, a crisis of addiction. It's been estimated that 80% of all of our homeless people across the country are addicted to opioids. The other 20% to meth, coke, weed, alcohol, or some combination of the above. In Los Angeles County alone, 75,000 people now live clustered in these filthy and squalid tent cities, ushering in diseases not seen since medieval times: typhus, bubonic plague, leprosy, not to mention skyrocketing levels of crime for miles around. You know, it's been said that our city leaders of these places are paralyzed with indecision about what to do with the problem. They're paralyzed with their own tolerance. Their only answer thus far has been more naloxone, more harm reduction, and of course a continual strategy of obfuscation and denial. The Office of National Drug Control Policy estimates that the average heavy opioid user in our country spends more than $1,800 a month buying his illegal drugs. So using this as our baseline, we can actually extrapolate out that the Mexican drug cartels earn nearly $2 billion a year just supplying heroin and fentanyl to these West Coast homeless populations from San Diego to Seattle. That's why they're lined up servicing these places, further exacerbating the problem. And to your point, this has been allowed to flourish, not because of the compassionate, progressive policies in these cities have been incompletely applied, but rather because they've been perfectly applied. But we're made to believe that our prisons are filled with drug users, that mass incarceration has been spawned by the drug war. These aren't just misguided notions. They're dangerous lies. On any given day, in our country, there are roughly 1.4 million people behind bars in all of our state prisons. And of that total, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, less than 13% are there for drug offenses. But that's not the figure I want you to look at. I want you to look at the other side of that equation. 87% of our state inmates are there for rape, robbery, murder, aggravated assault, grand larceny. Folks, our prisons are not filled with mere drug users. They're not even filled with drug traffickers. They're filled with violent criminals and serial thieves, and they are exactly where they need to be if we care anything at all about the protection of our society. But it's become fashionable to mock and vilify those who enforce the law as the bad guys, the ones standing in the way of unrestrained liberty. This has been allowed to flourish and threaten us all by both a polluted popular culture and politicians who pander instead of lead. They take to the streets to express their indignation at what they consider to be systemic police racism and oppression. But I'd like to remind you that indignation is not a counter principle or an opposing argument. It's an emotion. At its core, it's simply an emotion of selfishness, of narcissism, of self-righteousness. Simply allows these protesters to feel good while they continue to destroy. And it's absolutely true that law enforcement does in fact bear an immense responsibility for building and maintaining trust with their community. But we should also never forget that the community shares in that responsibility too. Now, by now everybody knows we're in the midst of an opioid epidemic, right? Opioids as a class of drugs, but most specifically fentanyl, is currently driving about 75% of all drug overdose deaths in our country. But America doesn't just have an opioid problem, it has a drug problem. Overdose deaths are also on the rise from cocaine and methamphetamine. It all continues to spiral out of control for one simple reason. The Mexican drug cartels are flooding this country with cheap, pure, highly addictive drugs by the ton, and we don't seem to have the political will to stop it, even slow it down. Fentanyl seizures on our southern border have increased 650% in just the last 4 years. That kind of increase is not measured in arithmetic terms, but rather in geometric ones. What's more, the totals aren't in yet, but 2023 is shaping up to not just break last year's record, but completely shatter it. The American pharmaceutical industry, there is no doubt today, spawned our current opioid crisis by flooding the country with their legal prescription opioid pills, marketing them like candy across the country. But the prescription pill phenomenon actually explodes the myth that it's been the war on drugs or even the illegality of drugs that's the problem. These drugs are completely legal, taxed, regulated, yet still highly abused. It proves the fact that every drug crisis is about two things: whether or not drugs are legal or not. It's about drug availability and drug acceptability. And by the way, it's also about the drugs themselves that don't merely provide euphoria or intoxication, but godlike sensations. Now, this quote comes from a former opioid addict who made that statement to a journalist just a few days before he overdosed and died and presumably met God. But you know what? That's a very insightful comment right there from the mind of a drug user that tells us that modern drugs are so intensely pleasurable to the human brain that many of our fellow citizens choose to ignore the potential pitfalls, including death itself. Our most tolerant and compassionate nation welcomes into this world one baby born every 15 minutes now, suffering from the horrid effects of opioid withdrawal. That doesn't even include the number of babies born to mothers on other drugs. What's more, we spend now more than $1 billion a year in Medicaid dollars alone treating NAS across the country, with no moral strings attached whatsoever to the moms and dads, none. And although modern science has come a long way in figuring out how to treat these tiniest of victims with microdoses of drugs like buprenorphine, their suffering is still said to be excruciating. You know, it's been said that the moral worth of a people can be judged by how they treat the most vulnerable and innocent among them. By this standard, our modern culture's stupefying indulgence of the irresponsible at the expense of the blameless and defenseless suggests a society that's become enfeebled and cowardly in the face of vice. Methamphetamine has increased tenfold in the last decade. There's more methamphetamine coming into this country than was ever produced domestically by outlaw motorcycle gangs and others. What's more, according to DEA Special Testing and Research Laboratory, in conjunction with several state labs across the country, the average street-level purity of meth today at the user level is 97% pure. There's so much meth coming into this country at the hands of Mexican narco-terrorists that retail-level distributors aren't even bothering to step on it, to cut it anymore. But here's the main point I want to make about methamphetamine that many of our law enforcement colleagues never stop to realize, and that is this: that although methamphetamine only drives about 10% of all drug overdose deaths, drug poisonings is only one measure of any drug crisis. The other one is the crime that it spawns. And since we know that methamphetamine is used and trafficked at 15 times the volume of opioids, and since we know that illegal drugs drive 2/3 of all crime in this country, both property and violent crime, theoretically then methamphetamine is driving 15 times the crime, the violence, the gangs, the drive-bys, the social decay of every kind. Folks, don't get me wrong, every single one of those drug overdose deaths is tragic. But for society writ large, especially for law enforcement, methamphetamine is 15 times the problem. And the Mexicans are pumping it out by the ton in these giant super labs, fueled by precursor chemicals supplied by China by the ton, by the pallet load, with seemingly no export controls in China nor import controls in Mexico. October 17, 2019 marked a critical turning point in Mexico's response to the drug trade. On that day, Mexican military forces launched an operation to capture Ovidio Guzman, Chapo Guzman's eldest son, known as El Chapito across the country, the Little Chapo, a significant leader in the Sinaloa cartel himself. They were successful that day in capturing El Chapito, but before they even had a chance to clear the scene with their prisoner, the Sinaloa cartel responded with such a violent paramilitary counter-assault that it resulted in, excuse the expression, a Mexican standoff. Ultimately, the President of Mexico himself, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO as he's known, personally interceded and ordered his own military forces to surrender to the Sinaloa cartel and give back their prisoner, saying that we do not want war, obviously failing to realize he was already in one. Such a stunning decision, one that would have profound and lasting impacts not just upon Mexico, but the United States and the world, had just led to the surrender of an entire sovereign nation to the thugs and desperados. Here's who's in charge of Mexico now. Make no mistake. Just like the warlords in Afghanistan, it's the narco-terrorists that call the shots in Mexico. If you're looking for one single catalyst, one single demonstrable piece of evidence showing Mexico's descent into a narco state, it is this, the Battle of Culiacan. And Americans had better wake up and realize what this means for our long-term national security to have this right on our southern doorstep. Allow me to talk about marijuana just briefly. It's what I call the cultural fault line of our time. Roughly half of our citizens now believe legalizing weed can be, all in all, a good thing for society. But I believe that half of our population have been duped, pawns in a colossal con at the hands of legalizers promoting a soothing fairy tale. Those legalizers have been surprisingly effective using two things: an appeal to emotion and endless repetition. By the way, those are the two key components to propaganda: an appeal to emotion and endless repetition. And of course, a whole bunch of money from people like George Soros here, known as Daddy Weedbucks to the marijuana folks, because he's personally given $100 million of his own money putting legalization and other types of measures on the ballots of every state he can across the country. Out to achieve a one world socialist government, open borders, mass immigration, the demobilization of the American military, and his favorite goal is the legalization of all drugs, not just marijuana. He's truly out to transform the U.S., and he's doing a darn good job of it. Folks, there is no such thing. No other true medicine in our pharmacological field has been approved for ingestion by smoking its raw form, versus medicines that are carefully isolated, purified, carefully measured, and then administered in a for a specific ailment. This is just like the snake oil salesman from the 19th century, where we're supposed to believe that marijuana can cure any ailment for anyone at any time and in any amount simply on the recommendation of a doctor. It's nothing but a triumph of bullshit. Propaganda. That's the word I use in my law enforcement groups. The average medical marijuana user today is 30 years old, has been smoking weed for 15 years, and has absolutely no major medical condition. Recently, the commander of the U.S. Army Recruiting Command publicly stated that 77% of our young people today, nearly 8 in 10, is currently unfit for military duty. Physically, meaning they're too obese or out of shape to pass the PT test. Cognitively, they can't pass the Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude Test. Or morally, meaning they have an arrest record or they're using some other illegal drug. Marijuana has been a huge driver in all of those. You know, just prior to World War II, Franklin Roosevelt once said that we cannot always build the future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future. Are we still doing that? Folks, our greatest enemies in the struggle are actually not the drug cartels or even the narco-terrorists. It's our own societal ignorance and indifference. And as we know, those are both contagious. But so are courage and engagement. You can push back. You must push back. Every night in your city, there are parents praying that their children not get exposed to drugs. You can help be an answer to those prayers. So I'd like to propose 4 broad areas that I believe as a country, as a culture, we need to begin to push back on against this existential threat. The first one, the public needs to know what law enforcement knows about this issue. That drugs don't simply destroy individual lives and steal individual souls, but devastates, decays, degrades entire communities and peoples. That despite the liberal narrative, we are not engaged in mass incarceration, nor are our prisons filled with mere drug users. That marijuana is in fact a principal driver, not because it's just a gateway drug. Yes, it's all of that. But more importantly, given modern THC purity levels, it acts as a kind of catalyst that primes the brain for other types of psychoactive drugs. You know, most Americans today have absolutely no idea how many people and organizations are actively trying to prey upon and destroy our nation and our people. They need to be taught. We're constantly lectured to that we must not stigmatize those who are addicted to drugs and thus need our help. Well, I don't believe anyone, public or private, actually targets for abuse those who willingly step forward seeking help for their demons. No, that's a straw man argument designed to absolve drug users of any responsibility. But since we know the vast majority of drug addiction begins as recreational drug taking, that's precisely the behavior that we have to stigmatize, at least every bit as much as our society's done with tobacco. We have to stigmatize the 15-year-old boy who thinks he's cool smoking weed after school, the college girl who thinks she's sophisticated ordering fentanyl from the dark web or Snapchat and paying for it with some virtual currency like Bitcoin or Zcash. And most importantly, we have to stigmatize those social, political, and media influences that normalize and glamorize drug use across our society. What I'm talking about here is responsibility, individual responsibility, self-control. At its core, the problem of drug use and drug dealing in our society is not caused by poverty, racism, social dysphoria, or some supposed root cause. It's about individuals not taking control of their own lives, leading safe, healthy, lawful lifestyles. Quite simply, individual character and lawful behavior matter. They matter for self, and cumulatively, they matter for society. If not, then as Edwin Delattre has said, the country's resources will be exhausted in efforts to save the citizens from themselves, whether or not narcotics are legalized. Lastly, law enforcement does not have the resources remotely proportionate to this threat. We need to substantially increase funding to law enforcement at every level, local, state, federal, and yes, at the Mexican border where we know the threat currently emanates from. We know with 300 Americans dying every single day that drug dealing is not a nonviolent crime. In fact, as former drug czar John Walters has said, it is the most murderous criminal activity in the history of America. We know after 50 years of experience since Nixon declared his war on drugs that treatment and prevention are absolutely essential, but that they're only strategically beneficial when we can reduce drug availability across America. We do that not just by targeting the drugs, but the drug traffickers. We proved that law enforcement works against LSD in the 60s, heroin in the 70s, cocaine in the 80s, crack in the 90s, meth labs in the 2000s. All of those reductions were not complete, but they were greatly achieved through the fair yet vigorous application of the rule of law. You know, when cocaine first started pouring out of Colombia in the early 1980s, President Reagan picked up the phone and he called his counterpart in Bogota and he said, "You guys either need to start doing something yourselves to stem the flow of cocaine coming out of your country, or you might as well stop sending us any of your coffee and cut flowers and oil." And you know what? Colombia stepped up and became one of our greatest allies in this global fight ever since. We need that same tough love right now with Mexico. And maybe more importantly, with given the chemical flows and the money laundering activities with China. Lastly, here's the big one. I want you to consider this a homework assignment to contact your congressmen and representatives and demand that we declare every single one of Mexico's drug cartels as a foreign terrorist organization to bring new tools to bear, new resources to bear against them. These are my three kids. Quite obviously, they've chosen to fight in a little different way than I have in my law enforcement career, but you know what? They understand the same thing all of you here in this room tonight do, that civilization must be defended, that this is our society, one worth fighting for. And fight we must, not just with caring and compassion, but also with an aggressive and wide-ranging drug law enforcement response that upholds the rule of law and what is right against a constant onslaught of predators who only look to get rich off the backs of addiction. To not target, arrest, and imprison those who prey upon our fellow citizens, sometimes with unimaginable violence and barbarity, would not just be cowardly, it would be immoral. Now we're going to finish up here in 1 minute, but just a quick mention of the book that I published upon my retirement from DEA. It's not about me at all. It's actually a set of academic arguments designed to push back against the legalizers, the apologists, the appeasers of every kind. It's actually on the curriculum at the DEA Training Academy, as well as the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and it's available on Amazon. I have some copies here this evening in case anybody'd like to purchase a signed copy. Let me finish with this. It is unfortunately true that the bad guys enjoy some distinct tactical advantages over us. First of all, they obey no laws. Secondly, they adhere to no policies and procedures that we must, being accountable to government at the local, state, or federal level. And lastly, as we've seen, quite often they comply with no civilizational standards of any kind. But by God, they're not smarter than we are, nor are they more committed to preserving and maintaining our society. So when you leave here, don't ever let the critics get you down. Don't ever let them make you think that enforcing our legitimate drug laws and securing our sovereign borders are anything other than the most critical and necessary tools at our disposal. Remember always the words of Teddy Roosevelt, who said that it's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man or woman who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best, in the end, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who, at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get in the arena. I thank you for your time tonight. We have time for some questions?